Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first keynote speak, Crisis in Capitalism or Crisis of Capitalism. We are very happy to introduce Professor Prabhat Patnaik. He's an esteemed Indian Marxist economist and political commentator. He taught at the Center of Economic Studies and Planning in the School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, and he was the vice chairman of Kerala State Planning Board. He is also an honorary doctorate here at SOAS. Today, he is presenting a keynote speech arguing that the current crisis of capitalism, though exacerbated by the pandemic, predates the pandemic, and that this longer-term crisis is the result of two things: a tendency towards stagnation that arises because of the growing inequality of income and wealth within neoliberal capitalism, and the inability of the state to counter it, because we're in a world where the state remains a nation state while capital, including especially finance, is globalized. So very, very looking forward to this talk, and I'm handing over to you. Thank you. Sorry, before I say that, due to the online format, we're going to hold all the questions until the end, and there's plenty of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very grateful that I have been given this opportunity to address this audience. The topic which is there is crisis in capitalism or crisis of capitalism. So I should begin perhaps by distinguishing between these two concepts. When I say crisis in capitalism, what I have in mind, at least as my interpretation of it, is that the crisis is for specific external reasons which are not necessarily rooted in the inner logic of capitalism, which are not necessarily rooted in the immanent tendencies of capitalism. While when I talk of crisis of capitalism, that really refers to a crisis that arises because of the working out of the immanent tendencies of capitalism. Now, the reason why it's important to draw this distinction at this moment is because economic orthodoxy tends to treat the current travails of capitalism as if they really arise because of the pandemic, because of the war in Ukraine and so on, believing that really otherwise capitalism was functioning fine. As a matter of fact, that I believe is wrong. In fact, since the collapse of the housing bubble in the United States, world capitalism has been sunk in a protracted period of stagnation and crisis. As a matter of fact, the decade prior to the pandemic was a decade in which the rate of growth of the world economy was the slowest it had been since the Second World War. The decadal rate of growth, if you compare decadal rates of growth, it was the slowest that it had been since the Second World War. And what is more, unemployment rate, which of course has become a bit of a problematic concept because of the fact that a large number of people are reportedly not in the workforce. But if you calculate unemployment rate, rectifying for or correcting for the decline in the labor force participation rate, then you find unemployment rate ever since 2008 in the world capitalist economy has been much higher than it had been earlier. Therefore, the fact that world capitalism has sunk into a period of protracted crisis and stagnation from which there does not seem to be any obvious way out is something which, in my view, is fairly indubitable. The question is, why does this happen? What are the options before capitalism, and what can we say about those options? when I talk about contemporary capitalism, I have in mind, of course, the neoliberal capitalism, which has been the dominant shape in which capitalism has emerged in the more recent period. And neoliberal capitalism is characterized, as you know, by relatively freer flows of goods and services and capital, including finance, across country borders. This is a very distinct situation, very different situation from what had prevailed in the post-Second World War, when you had national economies over which the states could actually have a certain say as regards the management of these economies. Now what you find is relatively free movement of commodities and capital, including finance. Now, if you have finance that is globally mobile in a world of nation states, then it follows that the nation state willy-nilly will have to pursue policies which are those that are to the liking of finance. That is generally referred to in the mainstream literature as keeping up the confidence of the investors. That basically means pursuing policies that really appease the speculators who are moving funds around the globe. The moment you have this kind of a situation, then, as I said, the nation state, so you have globalized finance, globalized capital, including finance, in a world of nation states. If that is the case, then the nation state willy-nilly has to be pursuing policies which are dictated by finance. Now, that has very deep implications for democracy. Democracy is supposed to be the sovereignty of the people, but as a matter of fact, no matter whom the people elect, they all have more or less the same economic agenda. And what is more, if somebody gets elected with a different economic agenda, then the capital flight that ensues forces that government to backtrack and pursue the agenda which others have been pursuing till then. Syriza is a very obvious example of this. So what you find is that the fear of capital flight induces in each government a tendency to conform to the agenda dictated by globalized or international finance capital. Now, this is something which, of course, robs the state of its autonomy, has very deep implications for democracy, as I mentioned. And by the way, Keynes himself had thought that Keynesian policies would work only if the state has a certain autonomy, and of course, because of which in 1933, in his Yale Review article, he had said that let finance above all be national. In other words, he was in favor of capital controls. And of course, the Bretton Woods system, which he set up, was one which actually provided for capital controls. And there were massive capital controls, very stringent capital controls prior to the liberalization or the pursuit of neoliberal economic policies. Now, one implication of this business of the nation state pursuing policies to the liking of globalized finance is that a whole range of policies it was pursuing earlier, it actually begins to withdraw from. One such policy is the policy of supporting, protecting, promoting petty production, including peasant agriculture, which is very important in third world countries like the one to which I belong. You have, therefore, the ability of big capital to encroach upon petty production, the unviability of petty production, the plunging of the petty production sector into a crisis, because of which large numbers of petty producers then try to migrate to the cities in quest of employment opportunities. The first implication, the crisis of petty production is absolutely central, essential to the pursuit of neoliberal policies. And that, of course, opens up possibilities, real possibilities of a worker-peasant alliance and of a political coming together of the working people, which means the workers, peasants, fishermen, craftsmen, and so on. Not just for political reasons, but actually because of their economic conditions. The second feature, however, of a neoliberal policy is that because of the free flow of commodities, or relatively free flow of commodities, you have a situation in which there is competition among countries to introduce technological progress in order to prevent being competed out. Because if India does not introduce technological progress, then imports from other countries which are doing so would actually outcompete Indian goods. So you find that there is an increase in the rate of technological progress, which of course takes the form of an increase in labor productivity. Now, as you know, the rate of growth of employment is nothing else but the rate of growth of GDP minus the rate of growth of labor productivity. So even though it may be the case that you have an increase in the rate of growth of GDP, which occurs under the neoliberal regime, so large is the increase in the rate of growth of labor productivity because of the factor I was mentioning, that the rate of growth of employment slows down. I'll give you, in India, for instance, you find while the rate of growth of GDP prior to the slowing down had almost doubled, the rate of growth of employment had actually got halved from around 2% per annum to 1% per annum, which is even less than the rate of growth, the natural rate of growth of the workforce. So you find that even as vast masses of displaced petty producers move to cities in quest of employment, the rate of growth of employment slows down where it is not even adequate to provide employment to the natural increase in workforce, let alone absorbing those who are displaced from the declining petty production sectors. Because of this, you actually have a swelling of the reserve army of labor. Now that's really a feature of neoliberal capitalism, which we have to reckon with. You have a swelling of the reserve army of labor, not just in absolute terms, but relative to the size of the workforce. The swelling of the reserve army of labor takes the form not of a larger mass of unemployed workers, but really of casualization of the distribution of a given amount of work among a larger number of workers, of intermittent work, of irregular work, and so on and so forth, so that everybody may appear to be employed, but for a much shorter period than before. Now, this, of course, also entails a weakening of the bargaining position, even of workers who have got some kind of a security of employment, even of organized, even of unionized workers. Their ability to raise their wage rates is much impaired by the swelling of the relative size of the reserve army of labor. Therefore, the impoverishment of petty production, the swelling of the reserve army of labor, and also the lack of increase in the real wages of the unionized workers, all these imply that on the whole, there is hardly much absolute improvement in the per capita real incomes of the working people, within which I include not only the workers, but also the peasants, the craftsmen, the fishermen, and so on and so forth. So you find that the per capita in real income of the working population tends to remain in absolute terms stagnant. Perhaps one may even say it tends to decline, so that there is a rise in the magnitude of absolute poverty. But at the same time, as we have seen, there is an increase in the rate of growth of labor productivity. While labor productivity growth increases, the absolute living conditions of the per capita living conditions of the working population does not. Now, that is something which basically implies that there's a rise in the share of economic surplus in the total output. Obviously, economic surplus in labor productivity minus the income of the working people. So, per capita income. So you find that there's an increase in the share of the economic surplus, not only within countries, but even taking the world economy as a whole. And this is something which has drawn the attention of large numbers of people. The rise in income inequality, the rise in wealth inequality that people like Piketty have been talking about is really a product of this. The rise in income inequality is something which is a reflection of the increase in the size, the relative size of the economic surplus in total output in the world economy and even in individual economies. Everywhere, in every economy, there's a substantial increase as far as income inequalities are concerned and as far as wealth inequalities are concerned. Now, this is therefore, this itself is of great significance for democracy, which even the kind of, Davos summit people are concerned about, but and social democracy generally has been concerned about, or that wing of the social democracy, which is critical of neoliberalism. But this has very important implications for the dynamics of the neoliberal capitalist economy, of neoliberal capitalism. Since the propensity to consume out of a unit of surplus is less than the propensity to consume out of a unit of income of the working people, you find that every such increase in inequality has a tendency, ceteris paribus, to reduce to the level of consumption in the economy. Therefore, for any given time profile of investment, there is a tendency for consumption to slow down, and therefore there's a tendency towards overproduction crisis. And when there is a tendency towards an overproduction crisis, the given time profile of investment no longer remains what it was. In fact, investment also tends to come down if it is the case that output is not expected to increase at the rate it was doing earlier. For both these reasons, there is a tendency, first of all, for consumption to come down, and then there's a tendency for the time profile of investment also to come down. There is an ex-ante tendency to overproduction in a neoliberal capitalist economy. Now, this ex-ante tendency to overproduction is something which should not come as a surprise. This is something which happens under capitalism. But this ex-ante tendency towards overproduction is typically, at least after the writings of John Maynard Keynes, supposed to have been controlled by state intervention. It was generally suggested that now capitalism can stabilize itself because Keynes has told us how to stabilize it. Now, that goes under neoliberalism, the third important feature of neoliberalism. Now, suppose the state is to stabilize the capitalist economy. Then the state has to spend more. And if the state spends more, in that case, where does the revenue of the state for spending more come from? If the state spends more by taxing the workers or by taxing the working people, whose propensity to consume is pretty close to 1, in that case, that is only a change in the composition of consumption. That instead of the working people's consumption, you have state spending. But in order for state spending to actually add to the level of aggregate demand, to create a net expansion of aggregate demand, it must be the case that state spending must be financed either by taxing the rich, who have a certain positive and significant saving propensity, or by deficit financing, fiscal deficit, or what you may call borrowing. So if state spending is financed either by borrowing or by taxing the rich, taxing the capitalists, only then would state spending add to aggregate demand in the net sense. But both these ways of financing state spending are anathema as far as globalized finance is concerned. Globalized finance does not, of course, wish to have larger state spending but by taxing the rich, by taxing the capitalists. And what is more, I mean, that's pretty clear. Recently, for instance, when Biden was talking about having a global corporate agreed minimum corporate tax rate, he had suggested 25% as a minimum, but as a matter of fact, the agreement could only be on 15% as a minimum, which really is not very biting. The other way of financing state spending, which is possible, is through, or which can generate net increase in aggregate demand, is of course through state borrowing. Now, that is something which is completely anathema as far as finance is concerned, because of which, as you know, in almost every major country of the world, with the exception of the United States, you now have fiscal responsibility legislation that actually puts a ceiling on the proportion of fiscal deficit to the GDP. Now, you may ask yourself the question that there is no floor to the proportion of healthcare expenditure to GDP, government healthcare expenditure. There's no floor to the proportion of tax revenue to the GDP. There's no floor to the proportion of wealth tax to the GDP. Why should there be a floor to the proportion of fiscal deficit to the GDP? Now, that is one instance of the insistence of finance, which every nation state willy-nilly has really agreed to and has fallen in line with. Why is finance opposed to a larger fiscal deficit? Now, that's a very deep question. It's a question to which I can return in the course of the question-answer sessions if anyone is interested. Let me now proceed. Because of this, state spending as a means of enlarging the level of aggregate demand is more or less eschewed under neoliberal capitalism. Therefore, the only possible alternative that is available to the state to stimulate the economy is through monetary policy. Now, everybody knows that monetary policy doesn't really work in stimulating the economy. Monetary policy, even reducing the interest rate to zero, is something which the United States tried. It doesn't so much give rise to larger investment as to the existence of speculative bubbles, asset price bubbles. And asset price bubbles can, of course, produce larger spending. But on the other hand, these bubbles tend to collapse. And when they collapse, you cannot really order a fresh bubble to arise. Therefore, the economy can be sunk in stagnation for long periods of time. Therefore, on the one hand, there's an ex-ante tendency towards overproduction. On the other hand, the ability of the state to counter this ex-ante tendency is itself restrained under neoliberalism. In fact, it's negated under neoliberalism. Therefore, the only thing available under neoliberal capitalism to counter this ex-ante tendency towards overproduction is, as I mentioned, asset price bubbles. Obviously, if you have asset price bubbles in the world's largest capitalist economy, that's the United States, then that tends to shore up the world economy as a whole. And this is exactly what had happened, because after all, the tendency towards inequality, the tendency towards ex-ante overproduction is something that hasn't arisen now, that arises from the very beginning, but that had been countered in the 1990s through the dot-com bubble in the United States that shored up the US economy and the world economy. And that the moment the dot-com bubble collapsed, you actually had the housing bubble that played a very similar role. But after the collapse of the housing bubble, there has been no such corresponding bubble to shore up the world economy. And what is more, with the collapse of every bubble, people become more cautious, and as they become more cautious, the possibility of having a bubble of comparable size recedes to the background. So asset price bubbles are the only means available to neoliberal capitalism to counter the ex-ante tendency towards overproduction. And this is something which is perfectly acceptable as far as globalized capital is concerned. This is the reason why, for a very long period of time, neoliberal capitalism managed to maintain a reasonable rate of growth of the world economy. Mind you, that rate of growth was lower than in the earlier post-war period, the period of I would say, the period of dirigist capitalism, when the state played a major role intervening in boosting aggregate demand. But nonetheless, even though it was lower than earlier, it was reasonable, because of which you actually had capitalist economies functioning with low levels of unemployment and reasonably high levels of growth. And what is more, within the capitalist world, some newly emerging countries like India and so on experience relatively high rates of growth. But with the collapse of the housing bubble, this entire phase of neoliberal capitalism has come to an end. As a matter of fact, Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Fed, when the dot-com bubble collapsed, he actually tried to stimulate a new bubble by lowering the interest rate. Subsequently, of course, people are generally attacking him and criticizing him. But the fact remains that he was doing what is the only thing available under neoliberal capitalism to do to boost the level of aggregate demand. In other words, attacking him is based on a liberal assumption that had he not done so, had he pursued a monetary policy which was kind of, not necessarily expansionary, then the economy would have automatically recovered, which is not true at all. So the asset price bubbles are the only means available under neoliberal capitalism to boost the level of aggregate demand. They do so by inducing a wealth effect upon consumption and even upon investment, if it is the case that the asset price bubble is in financial assets, which lowers the cost of borrowing for the capital. Therefore, investment gets stimulated. So, but of course, as I mentioned, these bubbles cannot be tailor-made. They cannot be made to order. You cannot hold a gun to anyone's head saying speculate and create a bubble. And therefore, if people have confidence in the revival of the economy or in the revival of the asset prices, then they would buy assets and therefore boost their prices. But on the other hand, with the collapse of every bubble, that kind of confidence tends to get impaired, which is why, while we have had bubbles after the collapse of the housing bubble, both locally and even in the United States, this is something, no bubble has been of the same size as the dot-com or the housing bubbles, which is why the world economy is sunk in a period of stagnation, protracted stagnation and crisis. Now, it is in such periods that typically capitalism tends to take on a fascistic form. This is exactly what had happened in the 1930s, and this is exactly what is happening now. That all over the world, you have fascist, semi-fascist, neo-fascist, quasi-fascist movements emerging. Now, this emergence of what I would generically call neo-fascism is something which really is linked to the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. It was until now, well, until the crisis hit, neoliberal capitalism could claim that, look, we are bringing about such high rates of growth of GDP, and therefore sooner or later it will trickle down to everybody, so everybody is going to become better off. So the self-legitimization of the neoliberal capitalist system was sustained by the belief that growth would continue and this growth would eventually trickle down to everybody. It doesn't, but nonetheless, that was the stance which was generally adopted by neoliberal capitalism and its myriads of spokesmen all over the world. But when neoliberal capitalism gets into a crisis, then of course it requires an alternative prop to support itself. It cannot promise, and this is a symptom of the kind of dead end, the cul-de-sac which it has run into. It cannot promise an economic improvement in the conditions of the working people, and therefore what it tends to do is to float an alternative discourse. This alternative discourse vilifies ethnic minority, some ethnic, religious, linguistic minority, creates hatred among the majority community for this as a way of creating a discourse that really, in some sense, mobilizes public opinion without foregrounding the issues of material living, the issues of their economic conditions. In India, it is anti-Muslim. Elsewhere, it is similarly in Turkey. Large numbers of countries, whether it's Turkey, whether it is India, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Poland, whether it's Hungary, Marine Le Pen in France, and so on, anti-immigrant. So you find all over the world neo-fascism as emerging as a dominant phenomenon. Now, neo-fascist groups exist in all modern societies, but they exist normally as fringe elements that, they are basically on the fringes of society. They move center stage only when they get the support of big capital. In fact, Kalecki had talked of fascism in the 1930s as an alliance of big business with the fascist upstarts. So neo-fascism or neo-fascist elements or fascist elements exist in every society, but usually as fringe elements. They move center stage only when they get support of big business, and the support takes the form, of course, of financial support, but also of media support, media controlled by big business and so on, in order to promote this discourse of hatred, promote this vilification of the ethnic, linguistic, and so on minority. Now, this is something which, of course, is what we are seeing everywhere. But what is remarkable in today's world, as distinct from the situation in the 1930s, is that contemporary neo-fascism is also incapable of resolving the crisis of neoliberalism. In other words, this alliance of neoliberalism with neo-fascism is incapable of overcoming the crisis of neoliberalism, exactly for the same reason that the liberal bourgeoisie is incapable of overcoming the crisis of neoliberalism. Why? Because of the fact that the way the crisis can be overcome is, as I said, through larger state spending. And larger state spending must take the form of either larger either spending that is financed by taxes of the rich, taxes on the class or class of capitalists and rentiers, or alternatively, it must be financed by government borrowing. Now, both are anathema as far as globalized capital is concerned, because of which neo-fascism is as hamstrung in boosting the economy as the liberal governments preceding neo-fascism were. Now, that being the case, unlike in the 30s, when, of course, armaments expenditures financed by government borrowing provided a means of boosting the level of employment, both in Germany and in Japan. Japan, by the way, was the first country to come out of the Great Depression as early as 1931, and it did so by enlarging military expenditures by larger government borrowing. As a matter of fact, once near full employment had been reached in Japan, the finance minister of that time in Japan said, all right, now let's call a halt to this increased military spending. But of course, the military fascists who were in power at that time wanted spending to be larger, spending to go on, and therefore they had the finance minister assassinated, Takahashi. assassinated, and of course Japan's militarization went on apace. Therefore, in the 1930s, since you had, looking at it differently, since you had the nation state confronting national capital, including big business capital, including national finance capital, the state could reach an arrangement with the national finance capital so that it could actually persuade national finance capital or even coerce national finance capital to allow it to have larger spending on armaments and so on. But now the contradiction between globalized finance and the nation state, globalized capital and the nation state, is a contradiction which holds as much under neoliberalism as it does, even as it did earlier, even when you had liberal bourgeois governments. Now, that has a very important political implication. That in the 1930s, there was a period, for instance, between say Germany reaching full employment and Germany really unleashing a war, particularly, even before the Second World War, the kind of, conquest of neighboring countries, during which, in fact, the fascists were quite popular. They were popular not only because of their general fascistic propaganda, the change in the discourse, but they're also popular because they had managed to bring about an improvement in people's material conditions, because Germany had reached full employment or nearly full employment, as had Japan. But that kind of popularity is something that is elusive as far as contemporary neo-fascism is concerned. Contemporary neo-fascism, in fact, operates not on the basis of promising a better material condition to the people, but only on one leg, namely the hatred against the other, the hatred against the minority group, the hatred against the ethnic and religious minority group. Now, that being the case, it's quite possible that neo-fascist governments may even get voted out of power. I mean, they would try their best not to get voted out of power. As Kalecki had said, under fascism, there's no next government. So they may get voted out of power, but even when they get voted out of power, they remain as a political force so that they may, given the fact that the liberal bourgeois government that would succeed the neo-fascist one would also be incapable of resolving the crisis of neoliberalism, these people may again come back to power. So we are in a period in which fascism is not an episodic phenomenon. We are in a period in which you cannot really say that, that fascism is going to implode, that by unleashing war, it is actually going to, in some sense, destroy itself, devour itself. We can really visualize, as long as neoliberalism lasts, a period of protracted existence of fascist, neo-fascist tendencies in the contemporary world. Where then do we go from here? How do we combat it? I believe that any combating of neo-fascism must take the form of combating the conjuncture that produces neo-fascism. And that conjuncture is, as I said, the crisis of neoliberalism. Therefore, any fight against neo-fascism can take the form of having an alternative economic agenda that can carry the economy beyond neoliberalism, that can actually bring relief to the people in the form of greater employment, greater, better improvement in their material conditions of life and so on and so forth, compared to the crisis in which they are submerged. And that must also entail a defense of petty production, because displaced petty producers cannot be absorbed in the modern sector as is generally presumed and portrayed in the mainstream literature. Therefore, even though the fight against neo-fascism would have to be fairly broad-based. You have to have fairly broad alliances in order to fight against neo-fascism, in order to ensure that people's fundamental rights, political rights are actually guaranteed, freedom of expression is guaranteed and so on. But there must be an alternative in the form of the economic agenda that is presented before the people. This alternative can, of course, has to be worked out in different countries. I'll just say one thing which I believe is important in the context of my own country, that is India. And this alternative I would suggest, would entail moving towards, not necessarily immediately insisting, moving towards the introduction of a set of fundamental economic rights of the people as distinct from, as separate from the fundamental political rights which are guaranteed in the Constitution. These fundamental economic rights are I mean, 5 of these rights which I have thought about and calculated about are the right to food, the right to employment, failing which you give a wage rate to everybody, the right to universal healthcare through a national health service, free, of course, free healthcare through a national health service, justiciable right. Similarly, a justiciable right to the provision of education, at least up to a certain level, after the school level, school leaving level. It can be later on expanded to university level immediately for everybody, which is free. And finally, the right to old age pension and disability benefits. The kind of old age pension we currently have is a joke. It's 200 rupees per month, which is an absurdity. It would just buy you, let us say, 4 or 5 bottles of water. But if you raise it to a living old age pension, 3,000 rupees per month, then you'd find that all these rights, if they are to be implemented, would require, over and above what is being spent currently by the liberal bourgeois governments on these various heads, about 10% of the GDP. The 10% of the GDP can be raised through just 2 taxes. Well, in order to increase government spending by 10% of GDP, you would need to raise government revenue by about 7% of the GDP because of the multiplier, that actually as income increases, some tax revenue would accrue back to the government. 7% of the GDP. The 7% of additional resource mobilization on the part of the government can be done through only 2 taxes. One is a 2% wealth tax imposed only on the top 1% of the population. And the other is a 1/3 inheritance tax, which is very low by the standards of capitalism, again imposed only on the top 1% of the population. Therefore, imposition of 2 taxes on top 1% of the population would be quite enough to finance the institution of a set of fundamental economic rights. I'm not saying that this is something which we can immediately insist upon, but on the other hand, this is the direction that we have to move. Therefore, if we are thinking in terms, of course, if you move in this direction, immediately there would be a tendency for capital outflow. I have been, after all, talking about how globalized finance dictates to the nation state what policy it has to pursue. Therefore, it's essential to get out of the clutches of globalized finance in order to pursue any kind of an autonomous, pro-people set of economic policies. And this, in turn, would require the imposition of capital controls. It will require delinking from the current globalization. In the advanced capitalist countries, there is an effort at the moment also to think in terms of enlarging the fiscal deficit. As you know, they are using the opportunity provided by the pandemic to enlarge the fiscal deficit. But on the other hand, even as finance capital may be accepting the idea of advanced capitalist countries enlarging their fiscal deficits, it is insisting upon insisting upon fiscal austerity as far as the third world countries is concerned. IMF, for instance, lectures to countries that they must not get trapped in the quest for austerity, but on the other hand, in a whole range, I think Oxfam studied about 85 agreements over the last couple of years in which the IMF has provided support to various indebted third world countries, and in every such case it has introduced an insistence upon fiscal austerity. Therefore, if there's a fiscal austerity, the condition of the third world will become even worse, and therefore it's absolutely incumbent upon countries, all countries, but particularly countries of the third world, to escape the kind of, to escape the stranglehold of globalized finance and globalized capital. And for this, they have to be prepared, politically prepared. By the way, the moment you do this, there would be sanctions upon you, you would be vilified, and so on and so forth. And of course, these sanctions would be hurting precisely those classes which would be normally your support. They would be hurting precisely the working people. But on the other hand, it is important that the working people really understand this, that the political formations carry this understanding to the working people so that they are prepared to make the sacrifices in order to come out of the clutches of globalized finance. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. I am going to take questions. We're going to have questions both in this room and online. And I suggest that we start by me taking a couple of questions in this room, and then we hand over to the online. So we'll do it in that order. I'm going to ask that when you ask a question that you speak into the mic so that we can hear it online too. So yeah, questions.
Great, thank you so much for your talk. Elena Hofferberth from the University of Lausanne. I am wondering, so this was really exciting, and I'm just wondering in terms of the prospects for bringing about these transformative changes that you have outlined, who do you think are the agents for bringing it about, especially as you have pointed to the limits that national governments face? Yeah, I'd be keen to hear like where in this, with all actors being kind of under pressure to comply with global capital, global financial capital, like who and how do you see like points for intervention? Thank you.
Shall I answer the questions as they come, or should I wait for 2-3 questions and then answer?
I suggest we make 2-3 questions and then we'll answer them. Thank you.
Charles Stevenson, Autonomous University of Barcelona. I wanted to ask about the limits to state spending you evoked. You twice told us that governments either needed to tax before they could spend or borrow money, and you also evoked, for example, Alan Greenspan, who during his tenure as chairman of the Fed said that the United States, as an example, could pay any debt it had because it controlled the production of the dollar. So I wondered what you felt, why you felt governments couldn't simply finance, for example, the 5 rights that you were discussing. Thank you.
Take one more question, then I'll answer.
Perfect. So we have one question online here. It's in the chat. Do we need a new world order to address the crisis of capitalism and the crisis capitalism have caused with regards to environment, with regards to increasing political polarizations, and with regard to increased economic and financial instabilities? Would these changes be possible within a democratic environment? Is capitalism compatible with democratic structures?
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. Let me take them one by one. Let me begin by the second question, because it's relatively easier. You see, if the government did not tax and simply financed expenditure on the rights I'm talking about, that's the same as the government spending by borrowing, because the government can finance by printing money, and if it prints money, then it's borrowing from the central bank. The government can finance by floating bonds, and if it does so, there's a fiscal deficit. So the government can either raise taxes or it can finance through a fiscal deficit. If it raises taxes, then raising taxes at the expense of the working people does not add. If the government spends the equivalent amount, the balanced budget multiplier is 0. Therefore, it doesn't add, it doesn't create any net expansion of aggregate demand. The net expansion would arise only if the government taxes the rich, who actually save a part of their incomes. So, therefore, when I was talking about, the possibilities, I had already incorporated the idea of government not taxing anybody and financing spending. That's the same as what I mean by borrowing. Okay, now, who are the agents of change? Well, obviously, this is a question which relates to the political sphere. Now, it is not, you see, the point I want to make is that it is essential to get out of the clutches of globalized finance in order for the state to reacquire the autonomy to pursue policies in the interest of the working people. Now, that is essential. I began my talk by talking about the sovereignty of the people being appropriated by finance capital, so that what you have under globalization is the sovereignty of finance capital. And that is fundamentally anti-democratic. I think that relates to the third question, which actually says, is capitalism compatible with democracy? In my view, no. In fact, I'm talking about contemporary capitalism. Contemporary capitalism snuffs out democracy, because both the government and the opposition, they are terrified of capital flight. They're terrified of not being able to meet the current account deficit by borrowing enough, etc. That being the case, they are pursuing an agenda acceptable to neoliberal, to globalized finance, which is anti-people. Now, any political order that sets out to pursue an agenda that is anti-people, it's not even as if it becomes anti-people by default, but in fact, it is necessarily anti-people from this very conception, is obviously anti-democratic in my view. So I believe contemporary capitalism is fundamentally anti-democratic. And I see no way that contemporary capitalism can move forward without squeezing the people to a much greater extent, which is why it would be more anti-democratic. And that is precisely why contemporary capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, is now having an alliance with neo-fascism. Because neo-fascism is fundamentally, obviously, anti-democratic. And that's exactly what we see in country after country. All right, so the agents, so now, therefore, delinking from the global or the neoliberal global order is, to my mind, essential in order to have, and I'll come back to the necessity for delinking when I take the third question in properly. That who is going to do this? Now, obviously, it is possible that the left would have to take a lead in this, obviously, because there are substantial segments of the left, not all of it, by the way, there are substantial segments of the left which actually see through the mechanics of neoliberalism, which are really opposed to neoliberalism. It is there in every country, and as a result, that has to constitute the nucleus of any kind of opposition to transcendence of neoliberalism. But on the other hand, the left alone would not be able to do it. It will have to mobilize people around it. And what is more, it has to mobilize not only classes, that of course it will have to do that, the peasants, the workers and so on. But what is more, it also has to mobilize other political formation. And this is not impossible. By far, this is not impossible. Recently, for instance, in India, we actually had a year-long Kisan agitation. Kisan means peasants, farmers agitation. The government tried every trick under the trade to smash the farmers' agitation. What is more, the farmers' agitation was against 3 bills introduced by the government to carry forward the neoliberal agenda and to open up peasant agriculture for incursion by the corporate sector, in a sector including international agribusiness. The farmers fought against it, and of course that actually provided, and the left was a part of this, that actually provided the basis for not only an alternative political formation. I agree that that itself did not give rise to a political challenge to the existing neo-fascist government, but I think agitations of that kind can provide a political challenge and can actually force even other political formations to come on board. So I'm very optimistic, and of course, as the people's hardships increase, then of course there would be even greater pressures of that kind. So who are the agents of change? I would say the left would have to be the core of it, and other democratic entities, parties, people who are pushed by the push from below of the various classes would be suffering because of neoliberalism, would really provide the core. Now, the third question is of course an a very important question. You see, obviously, when we talk about the class support for an alternative agenda, this class support would have to be, as I said, the working people. Fundamentally, they have to be at the center of it. That means the workers, the peasants, the petty producers, the craftsmen, fishermen, and so on and so forth. Now, let's just call it the Worker-Peasant Alliance. So the Worker-Peasant Alliance would have to be at the center of an alternative of the struggle against neoliberalism. Now, in the world today, you really do not have an international working class movement. So much so that when Syriza, when the Greek crisis happened, to my knowledge, there was no major working class uprising all over Europe in solidarity with the Greek workers. So there is no real international working class movement today. And likewise, there's no international peasant movement. It's even more of a far cry to think in terms of an international peasant movement. Now, that being the case, to wait for an international movement of workers and peasants is like in Samuel Beckett's play, waiting for Godot. That means it'll never come, or it'll not come in the foreseeable future, during which neoliberalism would have wreaked massive havoc on the world economy and the world's people. So that being the case, we'll have to think in terms of individual countries where it is propitious for the workers and peasants to come together and to have a change of government. They have to be, of course, told of the resistance put up by imperialism against the kind of movement that they are launching, but on the other hand, there is no way. So it will have to be based on individual nations within which this actually operates, because you have trade unions which are nationally organized, you have peasant movements which are nationally organized, and so on. But if that happens, then of course there is no alternative to delinking from the existing world order. Now, of course, this delinking will be followed, necessarily be followed by a relinking at a later stage with a democratic world order. But that is not the same as the transformation of the existing anti-democratic world order. Well, we have to work for it, but on the other hand, I believe that change would have to come through delinking first in particular countries, followed by relinking later. Now, the moment one talks about delinking, immediately, in many segments of the left, there is a fear that there is a retreat to nationalism, that nationalism is a reactionary force and there's a retreat to nationalism. I would like to differ, and I'd like to suggest that we have to distinguish between aggressive nationalism that is chauvinist and imperialist, and of course, anti-colonial nationalism that is a part of people's liberation. So you cannot talk of third world nationalism exactly in the same breath as you talk of post-Westphalian nationalism in Europe. Post-Westphalian nationalism, I mean, post-nationalism following the Westphalian peace treaties in Europe was one that was associated with an imperialist drive all over the world. In fact, Cromwell's conquest of Ireland was the first imperialist drive that actually happened within months of the Westphalian peace treaties. But on the other hand, the third world nationalism that we have seen in the 20th century is essentially anti-colonial nationalism. It's an inclusive nationalism that tried to include everybody. And what is more, what you see, neo-fascism is not carrying forward a third world nationalist agenda. On the contrary, it is actually something which is more akin to the post-Westphalian European nationalism that always located a minority within the countries, the Protestants in Southern Europe, the Catholics in Northern Europe, the Jews everywhere, and so on. So it's very, very similar to the post-Westphalian European nationalism. And of course, it has imperialist ambitions. It cannot indulge in today's world, but nonetheless. So I would suggest that, yes, a new world order. We have to fight for a new world order, but this new world order can be fought only by countries which themselves have a relatively autonomous state, autonomous of finance capital, and of course that autonomy requires delinking. So on the basis of some degree of delinking, then we can think in terms of relinking.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions online? Brilliant. Sophia, do you want to, or does that become awkward? Right, we'll do that again. So we'll start with questions in this room, and then we will take one or two online questions.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I have only one question. If we imagine then countries got out of the globalization economy and they confronted this global financial capital, in your point of view, what are the mechanisms to confront the national capitalistic class that is integrated and that is consolidated in all the national systems? Because from my point of view, it is capitalism weapon to survive and persist, and I wanted to know what's your opinion.
Okay, I'll probably take one more question and then I'll answer both.
My name's Shan Turnbull from Australia, and my question is, do you believe it is possible to democratize the wealth of nations and remake capitalism with tax incentives to investors to give up a small percent of their ownership each year to the stakeholders? So after 20 years, corporations become 100% owned by the stakeholders, and you've phased out all the investors. And the tax incentive is self-reinforcing and self-financing because stakeholders pay tax at a higher rate than investors do. And they elect politicians who can say, we'll provide a universal well-being income for all stakeholders in the community who vote for me and vote for the tax incentives to make investors get a bigger profit quicker with less risk.
Thank you. The first question, yes, of course. When I talk about globalized capital, globalized finance capital, I already include within it the domestic big business that is, as you said, integrated to this entire network. The domestic big business is as globalized as any other big business. So the thing is that, nowadays in country, you see, in the old days, we talked in terms of the Indian bourgeoisie versus British capital versus metropolitan capital and so on. But now the Indian bourgeoisie, big bourgeoisie itself is globalized. It is going all over the world in quest of profits. It is actually in investing in mines in Australia. It is investing in steel plants in Europe and so on and so on. So it is actually itself globalized. Therefore, I am not drawing a distinction between globalized finance capital and the domestic big bourgeoisie, because they are really part of the same ethos and they pursue the same kinds of policies, which incidentally makes delinking or which makes an attempt on the part of the state, of let's say a state based on the support of the working people, to get rid of the hegemony of globalized finance, that much more difficult, because firstly, you would have to confront the domestic capital, the domestic big business, whose media would vilify you, which would give huge amounts of money to the neo-fascists, which it's doing, and therefore it's very difficult to do that. And secondly, even if you do that, then you will have imperialist sanctions, then you will be called a rogue country, and then there'll be all kinds of pressures on you, because of which, it makes it even more difficult, as we know from the Latin American experience. But on the other hand, let us not forget that a lot of the Latin American countries are surviving despite the sanctions. Yes, it makes life difficult, but they are surviving despite the sanctions. The point is that the support of the working people behind a delinking regime must not be allowed to fade away, because the working people must be aware of the potential threat to their desire for liberation that would come from all these pressure tactics. So I would suggest that it's difficult, but on the other hand, it is, as many Latin American countries have shown, it is not insurmountable. Big countries have an advantage. Small countries may have to come together in order to provide a viable union that can resist imperialist pressure. Big countries like, say, India or Indonesia would have an advantage because it is a potentially fairly diversified economy. Frankly, the only commodity that we in India would really are dependent upon the world for, potentially, is oil. And you can always get oil by having a bilateral agreement with Iran that is also a victim of sanctions. So the point is that, big countries which have a relatively diversified production structure, or can have a relatively diversified production structure, are at a certain immediate advantage as far as is delinking and overthrowing the hegemony of globalized finance. But on the other hand, this is something for which small countries have to strive, neighboring small countries have to come together. Let me give you one example, which is that all over Africa, now we are talking about, because of the Ukraine war, Africa being threatened by famine, by food shortage. Why is it that Africa is suddenly threatened by famine and food shortage? Africa is threatened by it because in Africa, food production was abandoned. Food production was abandoned and land shifted to the production of cash crops. And why did that happen? That happened as a part of neoliberal economic policies. Neoliberal economic policies, which basically mean the advanced capitalist countries have a lot of food grains surplus, and therefore they said that we won't give you food grains, you don't have to grow it yourself. On the other hand, please grow those crops which we require. And this was legitimized in the name of perhaps the most kind of ideological, not consciously ideological theory, but Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage and so on, which is really a complete non sequitur. So Africa abandoned its food security. Now, if you have to de-link from the hegemony of globalized finance, then you have to grow your own food. Now, obviously, every country, every small country may not be able to do it, but you have to have arrangements whereby there can be food self-sufficiency in regions, transcending countries, in sort of supra-country arrangements. So the thing is that, you know, you'd have to therefore have such arrangements. But as I said, it's difficult, but not insurmountable. Now, the question about, I obviously have thought about this scheme, the question about taxes to make people, you know, tax incentives to diffuse ownership. Now, the point is that you have thought about it, and I appreciate that, but I don't think it's possible. I mean, I don't think you can actually, by providing tax incentives, convert capitalism into some kind of a humane system, because there would be enormous resistance as far as capitalism is concerned. And if you're willing to take on that resistance, then you would have to proceed on the basis of the support of the working people, and the working people would require an agenda that is not just, as it were, shifting of a certain percentage of equity to social ownership, but it would require an agenda that is much more far-reaching. You know, we don't have to go very far. Just look at what happened to Biden's corporate tax proposal. Biden's corporate tax proposal is very small. You know, he wanted to tax the corporates in America. Now, obviously, you can't tax the corporates in America if other countries are actually not raising their tax rates, because then the corporates would show their profits elsewhere. So they wanted a minimum agreed corporate tax rate, but the minimum agreed corporate tax rate that every country agreed to was something like 15%, as opposed to 25% wanted by Biden. And consequently, that 15% means nothing. And consequently, the opposition that would be raised by capital to any such proposal, the overcoming of that opposition would require class mobilization. And if it requires class mobilization, it will require a class agenda. And that class agenda is something that will have to go much beyond simply transferring bits of capitalist property to social ownership every year.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question online. Do you want to open it? So we had a question here in the chat. The idea of universal basic income has gained prominence in recent times. Even developing countries have been considering it. For instance, India has been implementing a scheme to support farmers' income. How would you distinguish between universal basic income as against universal economic rights in their potential to address the crisis of neoliberalism? I also wonder if you should take a second question if we have one.
Yes.
Law.
Okay, let me answer this universal basic income. You know, I'm opposed to a universal basic income, not because I believe that it is not humane and so on, but you know, but a universal basic income is a largesse on the part of the state. And basically, you are saying that, yes, you know, we have to give a minimum to everybody. No, people as citizens must have rights. The state cannot be allowed in some years to provide the universal basic income, and in other years not to raise it when prices are rising, or to even lower it, saying that, look, we are in very difficult conditions at the moment, our fiscal situation is very tight, therefore we are reducing the universal basic income. The point is that any scheme which actually thinks of the people as only at the receiving end of largesse on the part of the state, I'm opposed to, because the people are sovereign. They are citizens. They must have rights. They must therefore, you know, appropriate what they get as rights. In fact, everything else must wait until these rights are satisfied. You cannot, for instance, say that, look, we have got to spend so much on arms, we have got to spend so much on government salaries because of the fact, because of that fact, we cannot really give you universal income. No, the rights are fundamental. After they have been satisfied, only then other modes of expenditure can be considered. So I am in favor of a rights-based approach because I believe it is in keeping with the concept of citizenship, in keeping with democracy, in keeping with the fact that people, I mean, that we are really talking about a fraternity of equal citizens, not doing good things to the poor.
Thank you very much. We have a question in the floor.
Yeah. One thing that mirrors with the global economic system is the global military order. So do you think there is a direct correlation there, or do you think there those two things will come into more into interplay or diverse in a sense moving forward?
Well, I mean, that's a very difficult question. And obviously, there is, I mean, you know, imperialism is, of course, an economic arrangement, but the economic arrangement is sustained by military might. The point I'm trying to make is that military might is determinant in the last instance. That military, I mean, it's not that if you are going to delink from this global order, immediately you're going to get the Marines or you're going to get some kind of military intervention. There would be attempts. There would be attempts at intervention, but, you know, of various kinds. There would be economic intervention, sanctions, and so on. There would be interventions in the form of attempted coups d'etats and so on, and, you know, attempted assassinations, etc. All that we know in the third world is a very common thing, and we have seen this everywhere. But military intervention, in the sense of sending troops, is something which is perhaps as a last resort, but not necessarily something which arises immediately. Now, as a last resort, military intervention is something which we'll have to be prepared for, but on the other hand, it's not something which I would immediately be worried about, you know, and the major powers have been so badly, I mean, their hands have been so badly bitten, you know, that they would also hesitate about doing such an intervention in the near future. I mean, you know, except as a last resort. So I agree with what you were saying about military intervention, but I would not think about it immediately. It is something which I would think about only when we have consolidated a state of the working people pursuing an economic agenda in defiance of global capital and with the support of the working people. I think only then we can think in terms of possible military intervention and prepare against it.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. We have one question in the front here. I suggest maybe taking two questions, so if we have a second.
Returning to the question of nationalism, which I think is more problematic, because if we take the Greek case, I think you saw that the Greek people voted to have a confrontational line towards the Troika, but there was they were in a way sort of betrayed, or sort of that no was not followed up. And I think, to make it short, that very large sectors of the European left saw any break with the European Union as nationalist. And this comes into, let me give another example, that when we come to the Brexit affair, or the Brexit, it is also mostly by the majority framed as sort of a something negative and nationalistic, which then makes sort of the working class sui generis in its sort of composition and attitude, spontaneous racist, instead of seeing that labor migration and the social dumping following by as a consequence of labor migration is sort of an objective material reason, complicated, I admit, but still sort of fundamental reason, so that you might also in Europe see that the delinking from the European Union is a precondition for building up something new and more favorable. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a second question here as well from Sophia.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Professor Patnaik, for the very extensive and intensive talk with a lot of thoughts to ponder over. I have a question about, you talked about contemporary capitalism and that being one of the problems, but I was wondering that weren't there tendencies that were a part of capitalism even under the golden age, even in the US, that kind of led to capital flight happening and the kind of consequences that we're seeing now? So even if we were to go to a state-managed capitalism, wouldn't those tendencies always kind of be a part of it? And in that sense also, what are your thoughts on actually a complete linking where an idea which is completely out there, but complete linking where there's a 100% mobility of labor, so a movement about opening of borders completely, even though that's a shock to the developed world, but then there have been a lot of shocks to the developing economy, but that kind of makes labor as mobile as capital.
Well, okay, thank you very much. The first question, I completely agree with you that the European left has been a staunch supporter of the European Union. In fact, the two staunchest supporters of the European Union have been European finance and the European left. Now, I can understand this because Europe has had 2 world wars and therefore the European Union project appears to transcend the kind of divisions which had riven Europe during the world wars and so on. But on the other hand, if any withdrawal from it is considered nationalism and therefore bad, I believe that that is completely wrong. I believe that the European, let me be very frank, I believe the European left's attitude to nationalism is completely wrong, because of the fact that they think of nationalism as one homogeneous entity. And the minimum I would like to insist upon is that Ho Chi Minh's nationalism is quite different from Hitler's nationalism. And therefore, anyone who obliterates this distinction is one who's actually not being very fair to the concept of nationalism. Therefore, any anti-imperialism that does not wait for the revolution to come all over the world, any anti-imperialism that necessarily has to start with local struggles, has to insist on delinking, and therefore to kind of debunk it as nationalism is to debunk anti-imperialist struggle. And I think that's the problem with the European left. I think you're absolutely right, and I agree, and I agree with you that you know, in the case of Greece, in fact, as you said, you know, it was actually a betrayal. I believe it was a betrayal by Syriza. You can say that, okay, Syriza's options were limited and so on, but I'm not aware of Syriza having even explored those options at all. Many people have talked about different kinds of options. One is, let us say, ranking the different debts that Greece owed to various creditors and accepting some of them, pruning others, and giving a haircut as far as others are concerned. I believe that these things were not tried out. The other is an arrangement, let us say, with other countries like China, for instance, which Syriza, to my mind, did not really explore. So right from the beginning, they fell into a trap where they more or less had to toe the American line, and therefore it was a betrayal of the people's mandate. Now, coming to the second question, by the way, I am not talking about a state-managed capitalism, because as I said, any delinking would have to take on globalized finance and its local allies, domestic big business. And of course, if you do that, in that case, you're not talking about a state-managed capitalism. You're really talking about building a society which goes beyond the capitalism we have known. So, and that, if you like, is a part of a transition towards socialism. In other words, it's not as if that you immediately nationalize everything, but it's a part of a transition towards socialism. So I'm really talking about an agenda that would constitute going beyond neoliberal capitalism, but a part of a transition to socialism. Now, you're right that, you see, why do I talk about contemporary capitalism? I believe contemporary capitalism in many ways recreates the conditions of capitalism that existed earlier. It goes against the state-managed capitalism that you use, the term of the immediate post-war period, which I call the dirigist capitalism, where the state played a very important role in intervening, and you know, in Europe certainly social democracy played an important role in building up the European state. In third world countries, the state played an important role in building up the basic productive forces independent of the hegemony of metropolitan capital, building up the public sector, for instance. Kaleski had called it the intermediate regime. I'm calling it the dirigist regime. But the point is that it is certainly true that contemporary capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, goes against that, which is why I'm calling it contemporary. But on the other hand, it actually revives many of the features of the pre-war capitalism, and of course, together with the crisis of the pre-war capitalism, that, you know, that the crisis of the pre-war capitalism was precisely one which we are, in a sense, caught into, because it's a position of anti-overproduction. One of the suggestions that some German trade unions had made at that point of time in the 1930s, and even Keynes had suggested that, is a coordinated fiscal stimulus by a range of advanced countries, by a whole range of important countries. You see, if you have globalized finance, then of course the only way to control globalized finance is to have a globalized state. Now, we don't have a globalized state, but a coordination among different nation states can, as it were, produce a surrogate global state. And so the idea was that you can actually have a coordinated fiscal stimulus. Now, that idea was not taken seriously at that time. That idea is not even being taken seriously at the present moment. But on the other hand, that idea, in today's world, when you have decolonization, that time you didn't have, would have to mean a coordinated fiscal stimulus that incorporates even the third world countries. But a coordinated fiscal stimulus in the advanced countries, which is combined with fiscal austerity in the third world countries, would actually reinforce a kind of global imperialism, which is something which I'm completely opposed to.
2 minutes left of the session, so I think we're going to round off here. Thank you so much, Professor, for an amazing keynote and for an amazing discussion. It's really amazing to be able to have these kind of hybrid sessions where we can have people from all over the world talking in one room. For the people who are here at the conference, we're now serving coffee in where the lunch was. There's half an hour and then we're starting our sessions. For those of you that are online, it means they have half an hour time to grab a cup of tea. And then we're starting our sessions at 4:30 UK time. But I want to just end this session by giving an applause. Thank you so much.